Folks, welcome to the award-winning cable TV show State of the State. My name is Barry Scheller. I'm one of the regular hosts on State of the State, and our guest for this program is John Flaherty, Director of Research and Communication at GrowSmart, Rhode Island.
Thank you.
And welcome to State of the State, John.
Perfect.
And the reason we're having you on, basically, is because GrowSmart, Rhode Island has produced this book. It's called the 2012 Briefing Book for Candidates and Voters before the November election. And in sort of elevator time, what would you want to say to the watchers about what this is all about?
Sure. So GrowSmart produces this book every 2 years before the election, and it's really intended as a strategy piece with some specific recommendations that relate to our state's economic development, about using our tax resources efficiently, and really about shaping and building strong, vibrant, healthy communities.
And why is it called GrowSmart? What's the idea of that?
Because it relates. We call ourselves GrowSmart Rhode Island. We're part of the national smart growth movement, and smart growth is about using your resources efficiently. I mean, when you look at Rhode Island as an example, our whole state is 1,000 square miles. And how we use those 1,000 square miles to do all the things that we have to do, providing places for people to work, in job opportunities, housing, recreation. We more than many other states need to be very careful about how we're using those resources.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of land to squander, that's
No.
for sure. Okay, so I'm looking through this briefing book, and you send it to what? You send it to all the candidates?
This year we actually sent out postcards, and the reason we did that was partly cost-cutting, but also because we wanted to expand our reach. Typically we'd send this to about 750 candidates after the primary. This year we decided to target it to all candidates before the primary, so it was something on the order of about 3,500 people throughout the state.
Well, good idea, because a lot of people get elected at the primary and they have no opponents in November, so if you want to influence them, that's the time to send it to them. You also say this is a briefing book for not just candidates, but voters. In what sense do you mean voters? Well,
because we've found that more and more people are getting more active in their communities, and they want to know what are the things that we can do at the local level as a citizen to influence decisions that are being made that shape the future of our community. So. Yeah. Okay,
one of the first pages after the overview is headed here, Public Investments and Incentives. And I can't help but think on public investments that we're facing a number of bond issues in the November election. What would you want to say to the voters about the bond issues, if anything, at this point from GrowSmart?
Well, I'll talk about the specific bonds in a moment, but when you raise the issue of public investments infrastructure, one of the reasons this is important to us is because we feel that we need to invest in our state. There's been an awful lot of talk lately and a lot of attention focused on austerity measures, and while those are important, and while it's also important that we put our state on the path to having business-friendly rules in place and getting our cost structure in place in terms of being competitive, we also believe that we need to be making some very specific investments in our infrastructure.
Okay, and again, that the public is being asked to agree to that.
Yeah.
So, are there any GrowSmart positions at this point?
There are. So far, we have come out in support of the bond for open space and farmland, which is, let me just get my numbers correct here.
I think it's number 6, right?
And that's a $20 million bond, which would cover farmland, open space, parks, water quality. Then there's a $25 million housing bond. And folks may be familiar with the housing bond that passed by an overwhelming majority in 2010.
Just 2 years ago.
Yeah. And so this is helping to create housing affordability, workforce housing, which is very related to our ability to grow economically. We've got very high costs of housing. And then the third one that we're supporting is the Clean Water Infrastructure Bond, which is $20 million, of which 12 is for wastewater infrastructure and 8 is for drinking water infrastructure. And these are some of the most critical core infrastructure things that the state needs in order to be able to accommodate economic development.
And before I ask you to explain the connection to economic development, you have just sort of, if I added it up, roughly $65 million in additional debt. So how do you respond to people who are looking at all this debt that we already have and our difficulty in paying any of it back? So how do you respond to that concern?
Well, debt is certainly a concern, and we're not advocating that Rhode Island go overboard in taking on more debt than it can handle. As a matter of fact, we're very pleased that this is the first year in decades that we won't be looking at a transportation bond. And there's a good reason for that. And that is because the General Assembly adopted much of the language that we put together in a bill for transportation funding that gets our state off of bonding for raising the local match necessary to get the federal investment.
Okay.
And that was something that was just becoming, unsustainable.
Yeah, and I've mentioned before on programs that I'm involved in transportation planning, and half of the DOT operating budget was going to pay back those bonds, and they didn't have the maintenance money they needed. Okay, so the next page is about revitalized urban and town centers, and so what's that about? You have some policy recommendations there.
So when we look at our urban and town centers, one of the things that we try to keep in mind is that, and that viewers should keep in mind, is Rhode Island is the second most urbanized state in the nation.
I suppose New Jersey being...
New Jersey is the first one.
Yeah.
And so we're an urban state, and we've got urban and town centers up and down along the bay from north to south. We also have this remarkable balance between our urban centers and our rural areas of the state, probably unmatched than compared to any other state in the country. I mean, you can be in downtown Providence, and virtually within about 15 minutes, you can be out into very rural area.
If you go in the right direction.
If you go in the right direction. And so we're hoping to maintain that type of balance and sort of stop the disinvestment that's occurred in our urban and town centers over the years. It's been a pattern that started in the 50s with the GI Bill and other things where the suburbanization went out and sprawl development. There's been less of that lately, but what we're trying to do is to influence policy to reinvest in those urban centers, because when you look at the innovation economy, a lot of those companies, the startups, they're looking to be in these sort of funky urban settings.
Yeah.
And so we need to make sure that we're creating the right environment for those companies to come in and invest.
Yeah. I was here in the state when Jim Dodge, who was president of Providence Gas, was one of the co-founders of GrowSmart, partly because it cost the gas company more to serve a customer in the fringe area than it did in the built-up areas. So he thought it was good economics for infrastructure investment, and I think your group still alludes to that, right?
We do, and it's great. We have this chart that's in the book. I'll hold it up. I know people might not be able to see it close up, but this relates to the per acre infrastructure costs for single-family homes by location. And you can see from this chart that the per acre cost for urban infill is so much lower. And it's just common sense.
Yeah.
When you talk about having more compact development, you have less per acre cost for all the infrastructure that serves that development, whether it's the gas lines, the water lines, the sewer, the road network. And even when you talk about the ongoing services, things like plowing and garbage pickup. I mean, if you have to go a longer distance between homes, it's going to cost more money.
Well, but then how do you respond to people, well, maybe it's only on the internet, I've heard this, but how do you respond to those who are concerned that what you're trying to do is force everybody to live in small apartments in the inner city?
Right. We hear that from time to time, and it couldn't be more false. We're not about trying to dictate where people must live or should live. What we're trying to do is to change the ground rules to enable the private sector to build more of what the public is seeking. And if you look at any of the studies from the National Association of Realtors or just purchasing habits, people are being drawn back to urban living. And yet, we don't have all of the tools and policies in place to allow the private sector to deliver on that. So what we're just saying is that we want to have a level playing field so that that we can see more urban redevelopment in addition to what we've built over the last 50 years and continue to build.
But there's a bunch of policy recommendations related to this on the revitalized urban towns, and could you just give us an example of one of them?
So, well, the one that we're the most passionate about is bringing back the state historic tax credit. We had it in place from about 2002 to 2008. It was put on mothballs largely because it was perceived as being too successful, if you can have such a program. There was a concern that it was too much of a drain on state coffers. We take issue with that. We argue with that because the analysis that we've done and we've commissioned shows that the state gets a return on investment on the order of about $5.35 per dollar invested in the tax credit.
Say that again. How much per dollar?
$5.35 return for every dollar
More than
invested.
5 times you're claiming.
Now the problem is it doesn't all come back to the state balance sheet. Some of it comes back to the municipal balance sheets, and so that's where there was a little bit of a I think a disagreement on the part of some legislators who wanted to put it on hold. If you look at some of we show a project in here in Pawtucket. Is the Slater Cotton Mill. This is a great example.
Maybe hold it up.
I'll hold this one up. It's a great example of a project that there's the before, there's the after. The difference to the city of Pawtucket is an additional $192,000 in property tax. So,
but that doesn't go to the state then?
That doesn't go to the state. It goes to the municipalities. And so there's a lot of folks with, and I think that as we've seen cities and towns get into fiscal trouble, one of which went into bankruptcy and a couple of others were teetering, I think that people are beginning to appreciate the relationship between the state and the municipalities, and that we need to be thinking about the health of municipalities as well. And this is a great tool that provided the incentives for the private sector to take buildings that were largely liabilities and turn them into assets, and at the same time revitalizing the urban core, and it drew more people in to live in these places. So to us, bringing back the state historic tax credit is job one, because we know what it's capable of producing.
Yeah. So I think that clarifies why you have a briefing book for candidates.
Yes.
Some of them will be elected, and you want them
Yes.
to know about this.
Yes.
Okay, let's go on to the next page. Natural resource protection. What's that about, and what's some policy recommendations there?
Well, actually, we might even talk about the same policy recommendation, the tax credit, because when you look at the state historic tax credit, it's been doing double duty. It's been doing economic development duty, and it's been doing environmental protection duty. And what I mean by that is that about 65% of the projects that were undertaken through the historic tax credit also achieved environmental remediation. It took a brownfield site, contaminated property, and it cleaned it as part of that process. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is we talked about this balance between the urban and the rural. To the extent that we encourage redevelopment in the urban areas, it reduces the pressure to push out into the farmlands and forest lands for development. Not to say that we're trying to outlaw that, but we're talking about trying to create conditions that are attractive for investment in the urban centers. And to the extent that you can keep impervious surface cover to a minimum in those rural areas, it goes a long way to preserving our water quality.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people move out to those areas or live there because they want to live in a rural lifestyle, and they probably would be encouraged by your efforts to keep it from getting overdeveloped.
But the interesting thing about that is that as folks do move out there, it's always, once you're there, more is always less. In other words, when you're there, and you've sort of staked out your territory, you really don't want a whole lot more people doing the same thing, because then it creates the traffic problems and so on and so forth.
The very thing you wanted to get away from.
Right. But conversely, when you talk about urban redevelopment, more is actually more. In other words, it's considered to be more attractive. If you're if you've put down your stake at the Slater Cotton Mill in Pawtucket, you actually want more development to take place around you, because it's going to continue that process of making it a more vibrant community. So that's something that's worth pointing out.
Do you have any particular thoughts about in-between places, like the suburbs around Providence?
Or the inner rings? Yeah, a lot of these places present tremendous opportunities for redevelopment, where you may have maybe a 1950s type retail strip center that's just been lagging and has a difficult time getting tenants. There are opportunities for redeveloping some of those and creating more of an urban environment. And we see that happening really all across the country.
Okay, and you're part of a national movement.
Yeah.
Do you have affiliates in other states that you deal
Well,
with?
so we're independent. There is Smart Growth America, which is a national organization. My boss, Scott Wolf, is on the board for Smart Growth America. But there's no connection between the affiliated groups. So there are some all over the country. They go by different names. Some of them are, 1,000 Friends of Oregon. A lot of them actually came out of the environmental movement. And we're one of the unique ones around the country that actually came from the business.
Yeah, I mentioned Providence Gas Company, yeah. Okay, natural resource we've discussed a bit. Your next page is transportation choices, and just like on the where people live, you're not trying to dictate. I noticed the word choices here, but explain what you're hoping to do on this.
So, as the second most urbanized state in the country, you can see we have a natural advantage to having a good mass transit system because we are urbanized. And we have been advancing this for quite some time, working with you and other people. Yeah. And so what we're calling for here is for the legislature to approve a bill this year to develop a sustainable funding source for RIPTA, because RIPTA for years has had an unsustainable funding mechanism in place, it's been largely dependent on the gas tax, as you know. And so as the gas tax proceeds have gone down because people are driving more fuel-efficient cars, or they're driving less.
Or they don't have a job to drive to.
RIPTA actually gets less money to operate at the very time that the demand for its service goes up. And they've got costs. They're paying for fuel, and they're paying for wages and so forth. So we've been working on this for quite some time. We've been putting bills forward. As I mentioned to you before, the legislature did take 75%, about 75% of the bill that we drafted last year, verbatim, put it into Budget Article 22, which got us off the bonding
for the DOT.
For the DOT,
yeah.
But they didn't approve the funding component for RIPTA, and we need to get that done this year.
Yeah. Well, it was important to do it for DOT also, I think, because they are also dependent on the same gas tax.
They are.
And a lot of their money went for debt rather than for repairing roads.
Right.
And as you know, there's also been you mentioned RIPTA, but there's also a commuter rail system in Rhode Island. Is GrowSmart following that? And
we are. Yep. I went down for the opening of the extension down to Wickford Junction. And several of us, including you, are working to try to get commuter rail better integrated with RIPTA, because if you're somebody who lives in South County and you're intrigued and you think I can get to downtown for the $4, actually it's
$3.20 from Wickford Junction.
It's less. So it seems like it's a good deal when you're paying $4 a gallon for gas. The challenge is when you arrive in downtown Providence, but your place of employment is beyond where the train lets you off at Providence Station. There's that issue of the last mile. And so we need to have better integration with RIPTA on both ends in terms of route coordination. We're talking about trying to have some type of a fare product that works for both, if we can achieve that. And then just do some marketing. I mean, if you think about commuter rail, some people hear, that Warwick has maybe a couple hundred people getting on, and Wickford Junction, I think their numbers are about, is it about 100, 150 in that range?
Yeah.
And people say, that seems like such a low number. But if you think back to when commuter rail came to Providence from Boston, they were getting about 200, 250 passengers a day at Providence. And now it's well over 2,000. Yeah. So it does take time for it to build up, for people to change their habits. And sometimes it's a matter of just having doing some marketing. That, and obviously the price of gas continuing to go up. Yeah. But we need to make sure that we're in a place that's ready to accommodate that. In other words, we can see what's coming down the road in terms of gas prices and energy policies and so forth. And so if you look around the country, other states, other metropolitan areas are positioning themselves for this, and if we don't do it, we're going to be a laggard.
Competing with places that did. And it's kind of ironic that, in my opinion at least, if I can give an opinion, that some of the places that are investing in mass transit are places that are known to be very conservative and Republican-oriented, like Salt Lake, Utah, Dallas, Texas. Places like that are really building their Phoenix, Arizona,
it's
building those things.
It is a cultural thing, and I think that, for any of us who have ventured to Boston and New York or Philadelphia in the local area, a good cross-section of the community takes advantage of transit. Mm-hmm. And in a place like Rhode Island, even though we're the second most urbanized state, there's still this attachment to the car, to the personal car. And we're not suggesting that we're not trying to force people out of their car. We want to make sure that there's the choice there, the option to be able to use transit.
I notice that you call it choices. And again, to the extent that your target is the candidates who are going to be elected, this is apparently an important policy area that they'll have to deal with.
It is.
Now, I happen to know that RIPTA is operating currently on an $8 million deficit. So they're going to, if the legislature does not address this problem, there's really going to be a suspension of service. So I'm glad that
they could completely run out of money sometime between January and March and just have to lock the door.
Yeah, so it's good that you're calling attention to this for the would-be legislators, and some of them will be. Okay, next page is about housing, and this is really important in Rhode Island, and there's a lot of we have problems ranging from homelessness to high-priced apartments and that people can't afford. So what's some of the policy recommendations here?
Well, and before I talk about the recommendation, it's interesting because you've touched on a number of very different topics that some people may say, well, what are you? Are you economic development? Are you environmental protection? And what GrowSmart really is, it's the intersection of all these things. It's the intersection of economic development, affordable housing, environmental protection, historic preservation, transportation. These things all work together to create community. And we've known for a long time that we've had challenges with very expensive housing, and which is why we've supported the housing bonds in the past, and we're supporting it going forward. There's many things that municipalities can do to allow for more affordable housing production.
Give an example.
So one example would be, particularly for suburban or rural communities, is encouraging a concept called conservation development. So for example, if you looked at this tabletop, let's say it's 50 acres, conventional zoning would say you can put one house per acre or
get
per
50
2 acres.
houses. Yeah.
Right. So once you know what your yield is, rather than requiring the developer to spread them out across the entire land, you can allow a community or the developer to group them together in a part of the property, get the same yield. But
what's the advantage?
Well, the advantage is twofold. One is you preserve a great deal of open space and the most important environmentally sensitive parts of the land, number one. Number two, you bring down the cost of building for all the reasons we talked about before, because you've got less amount of road to pave, less amount of utilities to install, and so forth. And the data shows that developments that do conservation development, their home values are equal to or greater than the more conventional spread out.
You beat me too. I was going to ask about that, because a lot of people associate the, quote, American dream with having your own acre, and you're saying that maybe there's advantages to clustering it. And I was wondering what the market actually weighs in on
well,
that.
And you're also talking about, when you talk about the environmental impact, if you've got those 50 homes all spread out and each one has a expansive lawn and they're putting the fertilizers and so forth on them, the impact that has on the environment and water quality. So you can reduce that and not have to go out and sit on a tractor and cut 2 acres of grass on a Saturday.
That sounds good. Yeah. Okay. So what else do you want to say about housing? You mentioned the bonds, I guess. Maybe explain to me and the viewers, how do those bonds get used? We issue the bonds, and then what happens?
So in the case of the housing bonds, those monies are used to lend to for-profit and nonprofit developers. When developers produce affordable housing, it's usually done with a full suite of investment options. Some of it's coming from U.S. HUD, some of it's coming from a conventional bank loan, and then these help to offset the costs to make a project feasible.
Or it wouldn't get done at all without some
Right.
of that.
Right. There's one other thing we talked about with the infrastructure, and it sort of relates to what we're talking about. It's one of our top priorities, and that is to give municipalities both the ability and the incentive to invest in their own economic development at the local level. Because if you look at any of the cities and towns, whether Providence, Pawtucket, Cranston, they all have tremendous needs when it relates to the infrastructure of their downtowns. Whether it's streetscape improvements, whether it's actual road or sidewalk projects.
Can't they do that normally?
Well, you would think that they could, but one of the things that is keeping them from doing it is what we think is a burdensome regulatory barrier, which is this tax levy cap that we have in the state. It's referred to as 30/50. It was put in place a few years ago, and it mandates that a community cannot increase its total levy. And the levy is the amount of money that's collected from all property tax. Not the rate, but it's the total amount that's collected.
Okay.
It can't increase by more than 4%. And while I understand that there are some good reasons for that, it also comes with some unintended consequences. And the unintended consequences is that it straps communities and prevents them from making critical investments in infrastructure. And so what we're proposing is to allow communities within designated growth centers. So if this is the community and this cup represents your downtown or your Main Street district that's in need of investment, allow the community to capture a portion of the levy growth that occurs within your growth center and reinvest it back into that district, improve the Main Street district before the levy cap. It's a fiscally responsible approach to investing in infrastructure, and when you look at other states that have a tax cap, like Massachusetts, they exempt all new growth. We don't do that. And in some states, they may have a cap on the tax, but it's on the tax rate. So it says that your rate can't go up by more than a certain amount. Right. And in Rhode Island, I don't know if there's any other states that do it like we do, but they just say you can't. It's sort of a disincentive to growth, because the community says, why would we bother attracting economic development to our town if it's going to end up costing us money, because the money that it brings in we can't keep. So that's one of our other top priorities for this year.
That's going to be a complex thing, I think, to explain to the legislator.
It is. But we've actually been selling it for the last couple of years. It's gotten more support from the cities and towns. The League of Cities and Towns has gotten behind it. And this year we just need to because it is a difficult thing to explain to people, we need to do a better job explaining it and getting out and building support for it.
Yeah, I kind of have to agree with that.
Yeah.
Because we only have about 2 minutes, just say a very brief thing about the agriculture section.
Sure. Well, one of the things about agriculture is it's one of the shining stars in our economy, even during this down period.
Yeah. All those farmers markets.
Farmers markets, but it's grown. The number of farms has grown over the last several years, by like 42%. And what we're recommending is that the state and municipalities treat it like a business, because that's what it is. And there's a host of things that can be done at the state and local level to make farming more economically viable. Yeah,
and that's a way of also preserving environmental quality for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
And then you have a page of outstanding projects. Maybe just mention one.
Sure. So we think it's important. We have to highlight communities and projects that are actually achieving success in smart growth. And one of the ones that I like the most is this Hope Artist Village in Pawtucket. And the reason I like it is because it was a decrepit, empty building before the developer came in. They used the historic tax credit. They refurbished the building. They're about 95% occupied with businesses, and it's just a great success story.
And one of those businesses is the farmers market in the winter, so it ties to other things, and it's right on the 99 bus line, so you can get there easily without a car if you wanted to go, and it helps one of our core cities of Pawtucket. So at the very end, I'll just ask you to let people know how to contact GrowSmart if they wanted to get in touch by either phone or website, whatever.
Sure. The best way to reach us is through our website, which is growsmartri.org. And then there you can not only get all this information, you can download this book, you can also sign up to get our monthly e-news.
And if people are impressed with this, they ought to, when their candidates come around asking for their
Tell them
vote,
about it, yeah.
maybe they ought to talk to them
Sure.
about that. Or if they disagree, they can talk to them
Sure.
about it, I suppose. Because, in my view at least, getting these discussions into our dialogue would be a good thing. And,
Yeah.
and I appreciate that GrowSmart is doing that. And all the details, I'm not sure I can sign on exactly, but I think that it's a good clue for how to redevelop Rhode Island and preserve our quality of life. And